Good afternoon. My name is Ashbel T. Wall II. You've heard me referred to as AT, and now you know why. It's a story too long to tell in the time allotted to us. In any event, I'm the director of the Rhode Island Department of Corrections, and we have as our calling card the fact that we are a state that successfully implemented the justice reinvestment model, and it's a source of great pride to us. The Rhode Island Department of Corrections is what's known as a full-service adult correctional agency. That is to say that our department is responsible for the state's jails, prisons, probation, and parole supervision. So if you're an adult or a juvenile waived into the adult system, any aspect of it, our department is involved in your life, and you are part of our caseload. And I say that because we've had the opportunity in my department to see the challenges and opportunities of justice reinvestment from every one of those angles. Our topic here today is basing programs and practices on science and ensuring quality. And I'll begin by citing someone who was mentioned earlier today, Robert Martinson. Those of us of a certain age, myself included, will remember the widely reported findings of Robert Martinson in 1974. He came to the bleak conclusion as he assessed the arid landscape of efforts to come up with interventions helping offenders change the course of their lives, that the shorthand is nothing works. Just to tell you how downbeat his study was, I will quote from his ultimate conclusion. With a few isolated exceptions, the rehabilitative efforts that have been reported so far have had no appreciable effect on recidivism. That condemnation was a challenge to those of us with an interest in reducing crime by working with offenders. Research, practice, especially in the past decade, have identified new strategies and policies that can make a significant dent in recidivism rates. They have been collectively known as evidence-based practices, an organization's use of scientific evidence to inform interventions that are demonstrated to be effective and efficient in reducing recidivism rates. That concept has been enthusiastically embraced by us practitioners. We want what we do to be meaningful. We want offenders to succeed. So there has been a great deal of interest and momentum with respect to evidence-based practice. But there is a risk that those of us in the trenches, such as myself and people with whom I work, there is a risk that we'll fall into a kind of trance. EBP, EBP, EBP. What my wife would call a pious coma, the effects of which are to obscure what the concepts really mean and how they apply in practice. So I go to meetings in my own department where we are all using the words. It's kind of as if we say the words, but we don't know the music. How do we design evidence-based practices? How do we implement them? How do we sustain and monitor them? What really is the research base for programs that work? What has been learned? How can it be applied? Here to open up that dialogue about those topics is Steve Aus. And Steve has the right credentials. He's assistant director of the Washington State Policy Institute for Public Policy. That is a nonpartisan research arm of the Washington State Legislature. I think that makes your organization unique. He has 34 years of experience in conducting cost-benefit analyses, communicating the results to policymakers in a wide range of areas. He's also done the same in the private sector. And his current work focuses on identifying and evaluating the costs and benefits of programs and policies that reduce crime, reduce child abuse and neglect, improve mental health, decrease substance abuse, and also improve educational outcomes from K through 12. Looking forward to what Steve has to tell us. We will then hear from Glenn Martin. And Glenn is currently the Vice President of Development and Public Affairs at the Fortune Society, an organization that I think is well known to virtually everybody in this room. Glenn is responsible for developing and advancing Fortune's criminal justice policy advocacy agenda. And prior to that, this term of service, he served as co-director of the Legal Action Center's National Hire Network. He's assisted thousands of clients with criminal records, histories of alcohol and drug dependence, HIV and AIDS, and he works with a lot of organizations addressing issues related to the reintegration of people with criminal records. And Glenn is going to talk about evidence-based practices and what they look like on the ground. How can EBP be integrated into the work of service providers and community-based organizations? What do they need from government, and what can government expect from them? I have no doubt that their introductions of these topics will lay the groundwork for some lively discussion here. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Ose. As A.T. mentioned, I work for the Washington State Legislature. I am an investment advisor to the legislature. The Institute is the nonpartisan research arm of the legislature. I suppose we're a little bit like CBO. All the assignments that we get come to us by the legislature. The legislature writes a bill and tells us to study stuff, so I'll talk about a little bit about that today. And what we've been really doing, we do some primary research, what programs in Washington work. We do that. But mostly what I want to talk about today is the other function that we do for our legislature. And that is that we provide investment advice, what works and what doesn't, in K-12 education, to reduce crime, to reduce child welfare outcomes. And that's what I want to talk about there. The Institute, you can see Olympia there, is right there, right next to the Capitol. The legislative session is going on as we speak right now. We're having to cut $2.6 billion more this year. We cut $8.9 billion earlier this year. We got to do another 2.6. So there's tremendous fiscal pressure going on in the states, and the one question will be is how is evidence and economics being come to bear on this outcome here? And I need to know how to advance. There are only 2 slides. We're supposed to do this in 10 minutes, so I only have 2 slides, but I do need to advance this. Is there a? There is. Is there a? I'll just jump down there and do that. Okay, so. That's okay. So I want to talk about fighting crime and pinching taxpayers' pennies. If you're a legislator in the Washington State Legislature, you only get elected if you're tough on crime. You've got to be tough on crime. I know some people have talked about not being tough on crime here. You've got to be tough on crime. You can't be soft on crime. But especially now, you need to pinch pennies. You need to use taxpayers' dollars efficiently. And if those are your 2 goals, then you're led to different solutions than you would otherwise be led to if you just want to fight crime. If you just want to fight crime, you build prisons. We've done that in Washington State. Most states have done that. It's an easy way. It's an expensive way to fight crime, but it does reduce crime. Prisons will help reduce your crime rate. It's just that it's become expensive and increasingly expensive as you do so. So what I want to talk about is this. From a policy standpoint, it's increasingly possible to do 3 things. It's becoming increasingly possible to put together a Consumer Reports-like list of what works and what doesn't work and give that information to a legislative body. So we've done that for our legislature. I won't be able to go over, we don't have the time today to go over the individual items, but you can look at the scientifically sound studies of what works and what doesn't work. Unlike the Martinson finding, in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been more research that you can point to about things that do, in fact, work. I think you want to have an independent group judge that research literature, because if you don't want to have the fox guarding the hen coop there, the chicken coop there, because you need to have an independent group that goes through, judges the science of all the programs, throws out a lot of bad science. There's bad science out there, but then in the end comes up with our recommendations to the legislature about what works and what doesn't work to reduce crime. So we do that. That's the first thing we do. It's also possible to take it to the second step, and that is to do economics, to say per dollar of taxpayer spending, where do you get the best, the most crime fighting for your taxpayer dollar? So we've done that as well. We rank all of the programs, that recommendations we come up for our legislature based upon a cost-benefit ratio, how much it's worth to Washington to reduce crime and how much did each of those programs cost. The smart state that wants to take advantage of this will probably want to try to put this kind of information together, because it's increasingly possible to do so, and it leads you to different solutions than the ones that we've been using around the country typically. The third thing that we can do now, I think, is to go portfolio. So it's one thing if you let's say you go to Franklin Templeton and you look at where should you be putting your retirement money. It's one thing to have a long list of their return on assets of individual things, but what you want to know is what portfolio of those investments should I be putting together if I want to accomplish a goal like being able to retire early, perhaps. Well, in this case, we want to see what combination of these evidence-based programs should we put together that will allow Washington to enjoy lower crime rates and not to have to spend so much of the taxpayer's dollar on that. So if you take that perspective, you put together portfolios of investments in the juvenile justice system, in the prevention system, and in the adult corrections system that look different than you would if you didn't take this more systematic economics-based approach. We've done that in Washington State. We've been working at it for about 10 years now, and we substantially reformed how we spend money in all those sectors with the idea of reducing crime. So we spend money on early child education, in part because we want kids to do better in school, but also in part because we want lower crime rates. We spend money in a portfolio sense in the juvenile justice system because those are some of the highest return on investment resources that generate prison savings later on, and we spend money on evidence-based programs in the adult system as well to accomplish the same goal. So the portfolio approach that our legislature has been putting to funding the right combination of programs has been doing just that. So the smart state's going to do these three things. I really that information is out there. You can use it. If you're not using that effectively, you need to learn how to use that information effectively, because I think you'll end up with a different kind of a criminal justice system in the years ahead if you kind of take advantage of that information. From a financing point, so that's the policy standpoint, how to go there. From the financing standpoint, how do you fund this stuff? Well, when money's available, then you just fund that portfolio. You know, new money available. In Washington, and prior to the economic downturn, we had new money available, so we funded our portfolio, these programs to reduce crime, out of new money that was available. Easy, you know, easier than currently. If you don't have extra money around, no state does right now, or only about 5 states have money around right now. If you're like Washington, you don't have money around, then the choices are going to get harder. They're harder right now in our legislature as we're trying to cut that money. But again, you can use this information. What we have to do at this stage is trade low return on investment resources, some prison beds, for example, for higher return on investment resources. Some of the evidence-based programs that we're seeing here. When we do the analysis of that, what we find out is we can find the solutions for Washington that keep the crime rate neutral, that will not increase the crime rate. If we lower prison ADP, more crime is going to happen. If we take a portion of that money that we save from lowering prison ADP, fund a portfolio of these programs, we're going to end up at least crime neutral, actually lowering our crime rate further in Washington, and we're able to fund it out of the prison savings and take a portion of the savings and pocket it to the general fund for our budget reduction. So the return on investment of these different resources is so great from some resources to the other that it's time to take advantage of that. Trade your low ROI resources that you probably have and shift it into high ROI resources, pocket the difference to help fight your budget deficit and fund the programs. And operational and budgeting, it's one thing to pick it. It's another thing to get it adopted, to figure out how to finance it, but the trick is to put the programs in place. And we don't have time to do this today because I'm going to hit my 10-minute thing. But we spend an awful lot of time worrying about the quality implementation of those programs, of doing the same program over and over again, making sure that we've got quality control. We've learned painfully from outcome evaluations that if we don't pay attention to that, the programs don't work the way we thought they work. So we spend a lot of time now doing that, and we've also tied our budgeting caseloads, we're holding our budgets accountable to those expected reductions in average daily population. You got to do that. We actually have taken several prisons worth of construction off of our official forecast of what we need to build as a result of the forecast, and annually we make an adjustment to that forecast to reflect that. And that's that kind of budget accountability that you need in order to realize the savings that we hope you'll achieve. So I'm going to stop there. I think I did my 10 minutes. I hope I did anyway, and go here.
Good afternoon. I don't have a PowerPoint. I heard that they're useful for keeping the audience's attention, but I'm not sure that's an evidence-based practice, so I didn't bother. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the agency I work for, the Fortune Society, and tell you a little bit about the growth of the Fortune Society and sort of where we are now and how far we've come and how we've built in evidence-based practices and assessment and so on in the work that we do, but how we put value in other places also and how we can sort of have those things work together synergistically. The Fortune Society was founded about 42 years ago as a result of a play off Broadway called Fortune in Men's Eyes. And we were founded as an advocacy organization. The play was written by a person who had done time in prison. And the theater agent at the time, David Rothenberg, recognized that there was a conversation happening after the play, because the play was about the experience the person had in prison. And he capitalized on the conversation that was happening in the audience with people who had been in prison and folks who essentially were just there to see a good play, to open up the conversation about our criminal justice system and how we treat people. And then he ultimately hired two of the people who came to his office asking for assistance, people who were formerly incarcerated. And that was the beginning of the Fortune Society 42 years ago. And since then, fast forward about 4 decades, we've built this holistic array of wraparound services for individuals. We've built all of our services around the client, if you will. And so we provide education, basic education up to GED. We help people to get into college. We provide counseling, case management, employment services, retention services. We're a licensed drug and alcohol treatment provider. And we provide housing to individuals. And I want to talk a little bit more about our housing model because I think it really plays into the conversation that we're having today. And we also have a department called the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy because we actually do policy advocacy. We institutionalize our policy advocacy work. We've always been advocates, but we've institutionalized the work. We make a lifetime commitment to our clients. I think there's some things that differentiate Fortune from many other organizations. So as soon as a person comes through the door, they become part of the Fortune family, if you will, and we make this lifetime commitment. We serve about 3,000 people per year. Essentially, we don't turn anyone away. We have a very low threshold for services, if you will. We don't turn people away based on the type of conviction. We also have a cultural competency within the organization that you're going to hear me hitting on as I do my presentation. Essentially, what we do is we hire from our client population. We hire from our constituency. So of the 182 staff members at Fortune, half of them are formerly incarcerated, present company included. So it's not just frontline staff, it's also all the way up to the executive level at the agency. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that plays out and how some of that is not captured in some of the evidence-based practices that we're talking about today, but how it's incredibly valuable in terms of turning out successful clients and providing role modeling to the clients that are coming through our door. So we know what works. We've been around for 42 years at Fortune. We have a sense of what works. Part of that is that we spend a lot of time visiting other providers, right? It's one thing to read about evidence-based practice and to hear about it in theory. It's another thing to see how it plays out on the ground. And so as the agency has grown, more recently as we've opened up the Castle, which is our housing development in West Harlem, one of the communities that are most impacted by the criminal justice system, Joanne Page, who's our executive director and here in the audience, took the time to visit other programs here in the United States and abroad, because we do have things that we can learn from folks who are doing work outside of the country. And we took a look at some of the evidence-based interventions that they were using. She went to places like in London. We went to California. We visited, the program's name has escaped me now, but programs from around the country, and identified parts of the programs that we knew worked, and overlaid that over what we value to begin with, our cultural competency, the role modeling, and those things that are really core to all of Fortune services and spread throughout all of the units across the agency. We know what works because we've gotten recognition from SAMHSA, U.S. HUD, U.S. Health Resources and Services Administration, and many of the federal government agencies have recognized us for our housing programs, our drug and alcohol treatment programs, and our cultural competency. Within the agency, we implement EBPs such as motivational interviewing, which essentially allows the client to drive the bus, if you will, in their treatment. Stages of change model throughout the agency is one of the EBPs that we use. We use one called St. Mungo's Star, which is one that Joanne identified when she was in London. And it allows the clients to sort of map where they are on major issues, and again, really allows the client to take the lead in deciding the direction they want to move in and meeting the clients where they are. It also works with visual imagery versus verbal. So I know Joanne, when she tells stories, she always uses this visual imagery. And one in particular, I remember, we talked about it on the train this morning, was about how our clients are similar to a lobster, if you will. A lobster gets to a certain point in its life where it has to sort of shed its shell and grow a new shell. And at the point where it doesn't have a shell, it's very vulnerable. And so our clients, they come through the door with a very tough face, and they get to this point where they're willing to sort of let go of the tough face and soften up and gain that smile and so on. But it's at that point that they're very vulnerable. But of course, every time I hear the story, I just think of a naked lobster, which is, but the point is that the visual allows you to sort of remember the core points of the story. So agencies like ours, as we've grown, we've realized the importance of EBPs. We've realized the importance of assessments. We've made a $500,000 commitment in a database called Harmony, which allows us to do very detailed analysis of our programmatic areas. It means that our decisions are data-driven, so we're making data-driven decisions. And data-driven management, it affords us data-driven management tools. But I want to say that again, that it's very expensive, $500,000. And it's $500,000 in unrestricted resources that we've had to identify as an agency to be able to implement this very powerful database. But again, it does mean that moving forward, we're making our management decisions based on data that's coming from this very powerful tool. But as government moves more and more towards evidence-based practice being the driving factor behind performance-based contracts and so on, it showed us that there's a value in investing in this, but it also means a huge commitment from the agency. But if you're only doing evidence-based practice, then essentially you only have half the loaf to run an agency like ours and have the type of success that we've seen at the Fortune Society. Again, it has to be able to overlay on the values of the agency, and you have to be able to commit to retain the original values of the agency if you know that works. And so I think of two things. One is the Castle, which is our housing project up in West Harlem. So again, West Harlem is one of the communities that are most impacted by the criminal justice system in New York. There we do motivational interviewing, moral recognition therapy, parole. The parole officer who's assigned to the Castle, we essentially have one parole officer who oversees the 62 or so people that we have at the Castle, has the lowest rate of violations for anyone in parole in New York State. So we know what we're doing there work. The other thing is that the people at the Castle have the most serious cases, right? These are folks who've done 30, 40 years in prison, serious violent offenses. The folks that one may assume have the highest propensity for reoffending, but just recently we had a parole supervisor there, and he pulled Joanne aside and whispered to her, like, your folks have the most serious cases, which is why I was being so protective of my parole officer, because now we have a new parole officer. And he said, but surprisingly, your folks are doing better than anyone else. And so we know what we're doing there works. We have these evidence-based interventions, but that's not what's keeping the place safe. I mean, Joanne's mom, who's 82 years old, goes in and out of the Castle, and no one's concerned about her safety. When we first opened the place, we even put door locks on everyone's door and gave everyone a key. We don't use that anymore. We had one person on each floor watching washing the floor. We don't do that anymore. We don't do any of that. And it's not a lockdown facility. People sign in and they sign out, and we give them a certain level of responsibility. But we knew we had to bring a culture that was strong enough to make the place safe. And we essentially just followed what we believe in, which is that if you allow people a role model for other folks, then they create their own community, and they create a safe community. And it works, and it works hand in hand with the evidence-based intervention. So you don't lose your value, but you also realize the importance of, is that my cue? The other thing I think about is the individual, it's your job. The other thing I think about is an individual who works for Fortune. His name is Mr. Campbell. And essentially, I call Mr. Campbell the sort of glue that holds the place together, because he's able to sort of move throughout the agency and problem solve, and he doesn't have any one unit that he really works in, but he's formally incarcerated, and he does something that, again, you won't capture in any evidence-based intervention. He is able to diffuse a situation based on the fact that he comes from the communities that our clients come from. He understands the language that our clients use. He knows when to step into a situation and when to stay back from a situation. He knows exactly how to stop a situation from escalating. And at Fortune, we could conceivably hire a bunch of folks just out of law school and just out of social worker school and so on. You're not going to get that. You're not going to get that. Recently, I was talking to a client that one of my staff members was concerned could have been violent, could have had the potential to be violent. And so again, this is how this plays out for us. I'm formally incarcerated. This guy is formally incarcerated. She's not. She came to me and she said, you know what, I think it's better for you to have the conversation with this guy. I started having the conversation with him. Pretty big guy, 6'2". I take him into my office, and I see Barry come up to the glass in my office, because we purposefully have glass on the executive row at Fortune, because we want our clients, you know, to be able to look into our office, to walk into our office, and so on. And I remember Barry walked up and he looked in, and he just knew. He knew it didn't make sense for two men to be in that office while I was engaging that individual. And he stepped back and he sort of hung back. And as I walked the client out of the building, I could see Barry 10, 20 feet behind me. But he just, because of the cultural competency, he had a clear understanding of how to deal with the situation, how to deal with the client. And we talked about it afterwards. And it's something that we see repeatedly at the Fortune Society. And it's a very valuable thing that we would never want to lose at the agency. So, okay. All right. So I'll just wrap it up by saying evidence-based practice is important. I think it is a piece of the puzzle, if you will. But there's something about caring and hope and faith that's the other piece, and that we don't ever really want to lose. And it's not as measurable, but equally as important. Thank you.
The floor is open.
We have a microphone here if you need to ask questions. Just introduce yourself.
Okay. I'm Krista Pierpont. I'm with Restorative Community Foundation and very dedicated to restorative justice, both on prevention and in coming back out. What you're talking about is really key because a lot of the people that we work with are better at working with certain populations than we are, and I have to be able to recognize that, and I have to be able to track evidence base on a practical level so that I can show that that's working, so that I can provide the funding in order to be able to support people like that. I just wonder, in the direction that we're headed, are we going to ignore the potential of those charismatic leaders within a community, or just kind of use them to make us look good? And can you address that?
Was that for me or Steve? Me. I mean, that's a major concern for us. At Fortune, you know, we realize it's also a challenge working directly with clients and hiring from your clients. I mean, Barry, for instance, as good as he is with dealing with that situation, I have to follow up with Barry and sit him down and say, okay, we need to go into the database now. We need to fill out a report, you know, and so he may not be as strong with writing. You know, I may get someone fresh out of school who's much better with writing, who's much more comfortable around technology and so on. But we have to be willing to make that investment, and not just the nonprofits. I think government has to lead the way. You know, we can't say to our clients, you're valuable, you can do something different, but I'm not going to hire you. Right? And if government is getting involved in this conversation in a new way now, and it's not just about let's lock them up and throw away the key, then government, I think, needs to be the model. which again in turn would make the nonprofits much more comfortable with embracing this way of doing the work. I mean, it's worked for us for 42 years, so there's value in it.
I'll just add, by the way, on charisma. It's hard for public systems to routinely buy charisma. You know, you might get lucky and get somebody that's just a star, but so I advise my legislators, when I read research that comes from a study that obviously had a charismatic person that got some terrific recidivism rate, I throw that study out because I don't think I can replicate it in the real world of Washington state agencies. So part of my job of giving advice to the legislature is to find the interventions that actually can be implemented on average in the typical public system that we fund in Washington state and the labor markets that we face in Washington state. So you don't want to if you can always find an exceptional program run by a charismatic person that got 80% reduction in crime rates, you know, recidivism rates. And I just don't deal with that because I can't rely on buying that over and over again. And so I throw those studies out.
Hi, I was asking, there's a pending federal legislation now that would provide planning grants to communities to develop a comprehensive portfolio of evidence-based practices to reduce juvenile crime, specifically, and juvenile violence, and implementation grants to get those programs up and running afterwards, establish metrics to make sure that they would work, and also to measure the savings, so those savings can then be reinvested after the federal program ended. One of the arguments against the bill is often that there isn't a knowledge base of these programs enough to replicate them otherwise. And it seems like your presentation shows that it's been studied, their programs have been studied 8 or 9 times that show that you can replicate them, get a return of investment of so much, and that's one of the main arguments against the bill. I want to know if you could provide any further clarification. Is that you think it could be done at the community level using some of the cultural competencies that exist there that wouldn't be there at the state level?
Yeah, so on our list about what works ranked by economics, you'll see a section at the top for adult offender programs, a pretty big section in the middle for juvenile offender programs, and unfortunately a smaller section at the bottom of prevention programs, for usually early childhood programs. They all have scientifically sound studies that I've read, every one of them. I read every study that's published in the country, as far as I know. And I want to know, can I do them? And so the juvenile programs have been one of the main parts of our overall crime-fighting portfolio. And as I mentioned in my talk, that's because some of those programs have the highest reductions in recidivism rates. It's easier, perhaps, to change kids' lives than older people's lives. And per dollar of spending, they have some of the highest rates of return, too. So if you have a program that works, that gets a 10% reduction in recidivism, and you got a 15 or 16 or 17-year-old, you're right in their high crime years. You're solving a lot of crimes as opposed to later in one's life. So it's an important part of our portfolio. When we add up our prison savings, we're forecasting out what we think is going to happen as a result of getting that 10 or 15% reduction in those juvenile programs, and those kids won't be going into the adult system. So juvenile programs are a necessary part of any portfolio, as are prevention programs. I mean, that's really the longer terms. Some of the best returns on investment are early childhood education and home visiting kinds of programs.
And all the ones in your study are ones that have been studied. You've thrown out the junk science, as it were, and look at the ones that actually are working already. And
yeah, so when I publish a list, I have new appreciation for Consumer Reports. So when I publish a list, the people at the top of my list I don't hear from, but because our lists get around the country and the world a little bit, I hear from everybody that shows up on the bottom of our lists, and they say, how come you didn't include my study? And I'll say, perhaps, well, it's because it was too unique. I can't replicate it. So I throw out studies that either don't have good research designs. There was a before and after test. And it's not a scientifically sound research design. I throw those out. But I also want to make sure I'm including only studies that I think we can faithfully implement with quality in my state of Washington.
Right here, and then Joni. Right there, Jay.
Yes. Can you comment on the methodology that you use between your 2004 and your 2009 cost-benefit analysis? Because I noticed that the recidivism effect is different between the two studies, particularly on the juvenile. And could you just elaborate on that for us?
So what we do when we do these, this is a methodological question here, so if you want to tune out, tune out. Yeah, we employ a meta-analysis of all the research literature, and we keep reading the research literature. So some of the numbers may have changed just because we've got new studies in there. But second of all, I get the faithful advice of Mark Lipsey, who's sort of Mr. Meta-Analysis, and he's advised us on changing our methods a little bit. They're not very different, but they're a little bit different, and generally a little bit lower. Some of them are a little bit higher. So we try to keep up to speed with the latest methodological thinking among the people that actually do things like meta-analyses, and we employ those techniques.
Oh, sure. My name is Cynthia Robbins. I'm an independent consultant, and I'm primarily working with Time Banks USA, with whom I co-authored a law review piece on compelling government to use strategies that work in juvenile justice, but it could be applied in lots of other places. I actually had just a quick follow-up question for, is it Steve? Yeah. Regarding your study. I think I saw an earlier one. My question is whether the programs that you study are only implemented in Washington State, or are you studying programs from other places as well?
Yeah, so what I do, again, is I read the research literature from around the world. Anybody that writes in English, mostly that's the United States. Just think of this. What I'm trying to do is give advice on how could we improve Washington State system, and what can we learn from things that have been tried elsewhere that we might want to bring into Washington State. Sometimes their evaluations are from Washington State programs, but most of the things on that list have been evaluated elsewhere. And we're trying to say, what would happen if we brought it into Washington State and we could produce that same effect size on outcomes. So it's a broad scale look. If to go back to your Fidelity investment advisor, you wouldn't want them just to look at investments in your own hometown. You want them to look across the whole economy of where you should be putting your money, and that's what we look at here. We try to find out what kind of things work anywhere.
Joni, and then I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to ask something provocative that's on my mind.
So I guess a little pushback and a question. The pushback is when you said if you saw an effective program with a charismatic person running it and it had good results, you'd throw it out. That kind of troubles me, okay? And then the question is, there's the evidence-based practice, and then there's the implementation. And what I know from studying different therapies is that one of the variables that seems to make all the difference is the caring of the therapist across all of the different modalities. So when you look at replicability, when you look at how evidence-based practice can be implemented, how do you figure in the issue of implementation and the issues like cultural competence, like caring and commitment, like the welcome a person gets when they walk in the door? Yeah. The mushy stuff that keeps a person coming back.
Yeah, actually, when I said throw it out, I don't usually throw the study out. I just discount the effect size. So that 80% reduction, I would say I have a standard way of doing it. I probably would have dropped it down to 40% reduction or something like that. In other words, I don't throw out a random assignment, but I discount the study because it's hard to buy charisma. And then your second question was, I'm sorry. I'm still on West Coast time, and
How do you assess the other factors that have
so once we decide that we want to do a program, we go directly to the people that design the program, and the best of those kinds of programs already have implementation routines. Functional Family Therapy, which is a juvenile justice program, has a whole procedure that you can use to make sure that the right functional family therapist is being trained correctly and being set up with the right people on the caseloads. So whenever we can, on those off-the-shelf programs, we just use the quality control mechanisms that have been developed by the program the originator themselves, and we try to implement that quality control faithfully in our state. If it's a more general-based program that doesn't have an off-the-shelf manual, then we'll bring in people that know something. I'm an economist. I don't know how these programs work. I just know whether they work and what's it worth to me to get them to work. But we'll bring in people that actually know what make the programs work and design a process by which we judge the quality implementation of the program by the agencies, the hiring of and the training of the therapist, the ability to fire a therapist that's not doing that. We've been doing that as well, because the videotaping of interviews and so on. So it's all part of it's the boring stuff. The fun stuff is picking them, doing the economics. I love that. The boring stuff is making sure how the programs work. But if you, as Ed LaTesta said, if you don't do that latter stuff, you got to have both conditions to make the change.
I'm listening to Steve and Glenn, and as the director of your garden variety correctional agency, I'm feeling a little inadequate because things aren't always that pretty in the trenches. I mean, the fact is our frontline staff are not necessarily all well-trained in evidence-based practices. Quality control is inconsistent. The studies that would validate whether what we're doing works for our population in our jurisdiction are not necessarily available. Now, the Washington State Institute for Public Policy is what we in Rhode Island would regard as a Cadillac. And not every jurisdiction has such a resource. And to Glenn, Fortune has a long history. It's a robust agency, very well grounded, with resources. A lot of the agencies with which we deal, and this is one of their advantages to us, is that they operate close to the ground. But that also means they're not all sophisticated. They don't all have this kind of rich tradition and can't draw on what Fortune can draw on. So what do you tell an agency like mine, each of you?
Let me respond to that. Because the value that I see at the Fortune Society actually has nothing to do with the agency's budget or how long it's been around or anything like that. It really does go back to our staff and who they are, because that's our to the ground. That's we don't even have to be necessarily grounded in the community necessarily, but the community exists at Fortune, and Joanne always says, let's try to create what we'd like to see the world to be right here at Fortune. And it happens in a real way. And then going back to the correction piece, I mean, people often look at me, and something Steve said earlier that I take a little bit of exception to, which is around the charismatic piece. Because people always say that to me. Glenn, you're the exception. You did 6 years in prison. You came out. You got to be the exception. You've been doing 9 years of policy work, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not that. It's that I was exposed to exceptional opportunities. That's the difference. If you look at my rap sheet and you do one of your assessment tools, I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now, to be quite honest. And the person who changed my life was someone who worked for corrections, who may have never been trained in any evidence-based anything, who put his hand on my shoulder and said, wow, you should go to college. Your grades look pretty good. That was it. I often tell people it was the opportunity to go to college while I was on the inside, but it really was more that person who cared and stopped and took the time to tell me that I had some sort of, something that he saw in me that was valuable. And so your folks, without all the resources in the world, if they care, that's enough to change people's lives. And so I think that's a piece of it. And that's what I keep trying to hit on. So I hope that story sort of exemplifies it a little bit.
And I'll just add that the Institute may be unique or unusual among the states, but I, as I mentioned to an earlier comment, the numbers that I publish assume that your agency would be very much like the Washington agency with all the strengths and also all the weaknesses and all the mediocrity. So that's why I discount those findings from charismatic studies. That's why I try to estimate what I think we can actually expect on the ground through existing implementation and existing structures. Once a year I have to make an adjustment to our state prison forecast based upon that outcome. So I don't want to overestimate or underestimate, but I certainly don't want to overestimate the savings that I expect from these programs. So I'm trying to estimate what the average implementation capability is in the state of Washington in our agencies. I will add that we try to programmatically improve our ability to do that by, as I mentioned, having a very specific focus on quality implementation. We really spend a lot of time and effort on paying for people to go around and making sure that those programs we're funding are being implemented by therapists that are actually doing the model. And if they're not doing the model, those therapists get retrained, and if they continue not to do the model, they get fired, or relocated. So we really put into a lot of administrative elements into both our juvenile system and our adult system now to try to up our opportunity to make those programs work better. But it is a concerted effort, and it's something that doesn't happen overnight. You have to start, and then you find out that didn't work, and then you keep, and this worked, and you keep moving forward.
Thank you. I believe our time is almost up, but Susan will give you the last word.
Okay. Really a question. Susan Tucker from the Open Society Institute, the After Prison Initiative. I want to ask sort of a variation on this question about charisma. With all the work that's going on in education reform, which is really stressing the quality of teaching, I'm just wondering if we shouldn't be listening to that and really be thinking about the quality of the people that we have working with people coming out of prison or people in prison, and to what extent that should make a real difference in how we actually look at that and evaluate for it, and at the same time whether Glenn's experience and the one that he related suggests that we should be doing a lot more education and training of people in prison and coming out of prison to work with other people in, education, social work, et cetera. I'm not suggesting that everyone who comes out should stay connected with the correction system at all, but I think that there's a resource there that we really may be not exploiting sufficiently that we could get a lot of leverage from. And I'm just wondering, I guess I'm asking Steve in a way, whether or not any of your studies are looking at that possibility, or you know of anybody who's doing it and what you're finding out.
I haven't. I'm just trying to, cycle through all the studies that I have read over these years about, individual programs here, going through the catalog, and I'm not sure that's been a topic, in terms of using ex-offenders to help, and I don't think I remember seeing that in very many pieces of research, and so I couldn't comment on that.
I'll just add that 2 years ago, U.S. Probation came to us in New York and said, we want to work closely with Fortune to help do job placements for our folks who are under supervision because we contract with the halfway houses and they're not as incentivized to do these job placements. Can you guys work with us? And because we are large and because we have resources, we're able to move on those opportunities relatively quickly before we even identify the resources because we have existing resources. And so we worked with them for almost 2 years before any sort of RFP came out from U.S. Probation for similar services. And so, of course, we figured, well, we've been working them for a couple of years. Let's, see if we can pursue this RFP so that we can gain the resources to continue to do the work. And one of the first things that my staff noticed on the RFP language is that you cannot have people who are formerly incarcerated working with people under U.S. probation supervision. And it was like, really? Even though you guys came to us, saw the value in our work, the value in the fact that we hire formerly incarcerated people to do the work over 2 years. I mean, they picked up the phone and called us and said, the RFP is out. Take a look at it. So obviously they saw value in what it is that we do. So we need government to sort of come along in what's happening in the field. The field has already recognized that it's important to hire people who've had similar experiences to serve as peers to help bring people along. And I think government needs to follow, and government, again, needs to hire people who are formerly incarcerated to be able to do the work.
Was there any change to that RFP? Or
it becomes part of our David Rothenberg Center advocacy agenda now to try to convince U.S. Probation to change the language. We were successful with New York State Parole, by the way, on a similar issue just a few years earlier. So hopefully we'll be successful there also.
Well, thank you to Steve and Glenn and to you for this session.